Wait, did the Supreme Court just legalize political bribery? Great question. I'm going to answer it in this video. But first, I want to thank my subscribers for voting for this story as the bonus this week. If you want to vote too, make sure you subscribe to my page during my next live event, or you can follow these steps and you can subscribe right now. Okay, last week, the Supreme Court ruled on a case called Snyder versus the United States. Snyder is James Snyder, the former Republican mayor of Portage, Indiana. Back in 2014, Snyder took $13,000 from a local Peterbilt truck dealership 1 year after the same dealership won 2 city contracts worth more than $1 million. Snyder was charged and convicted of violating a federal law that makes it illegal for state and local officials to corruptly solicit or accept anything of value from any person intending to be influenced or rewarded for an official act. Snyder was sentenced to 1 year and 9 months in prison. Well, Snyder appealed, saying the actual federal statute only criminalizes bribes, not gratuities. And Snyder said that 13 grand was not a reward for the city contract. He argued it was payment because he was working as a consultant for Peterbilt. His case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and in a 6-3 ruling, all of the conservative justices sided with Snyder. And just wait till you hear what Justice Jackson had to say in her dissent. In the majority opinion written by Justice Kavanaugh, he points out that federal and state laws spell out 2 kinds of payments to public officials: bribes and gratuities. Now, under the law, bribes are payments made or agreed to before an official act in order to influence a public official, and gratuities are payments made to a public official after an official act as a reward or token of appreciation. Kavanaugh writes, while American law generally treats bribes as inherently corrupt and unlawful, the law's treatment of gratuities is more nuanced. The Supreme Court ruled the specific federal law Snyder was convicted of violating prohibits bribes, but it does not make it a crime for those officials to accept gratuities for their past acts. How the hell is that legal? Well, the courts just ruled the way the federal law is written suggests that it was only meant to cover federal and state bribery ahead of an official act. That, under the law, is punishable up to 15 years in prison. No one's questioning that part. The question is about gratuities. There's a separate federal law that forbids officials from also accepting illegal gratuities, and if convicted of that crime, they could face up to 2 years in prison. But in last week's opinion, the Supreme Court's conservatives ruled that in that law, Congress didn't specifically say the gratuities statute applies to local and state officials, only federal ones. Kavanaugh writes, all states have different customs when it comes to gifts. So until Congress passes a gratuities law that applies to state officials, the Supreme Court needs to stay out of it. He wrote, the differing approaches by the state and local governments reflect policy judgments about when gifts expressing appreciation to public officials for their past acts cross the line from the innocuous to the problematic. Those carefully calibrated policy decisions would be gutted if the Supreme Court were to accept the government's interpretation of the law. Well, in her dissent, Justice Jackson said the conservative majority was choosing to ignore the plain text of the law, and instead, they are carving out an exception for state officials that does not exist. Not only did she take a dig at Snyder, but she also took a dig at her conservative colleagues. She wrote, Snyder's absurd and atextual reading of the statute is one only today's court would love. If you want to read this opinion for yourself, I will email it out to you in my next News Girl News Roundup email, so make sure you sign yourself up.